I have a different role than a clerk for a federal court judge. So we're in front of typically very learned people with good pedigree and without the political element to it. The best part about federal court that we found, as opposed to state court. In state court, anybody who's owned a note and foreclosed on it in New York knows that you have endless litigation, nonsense litigation to stall off the process. And as long as the defendant is capable of making motions or the attorney has been paid to make motions, the motions will keep coming, orders to show cause after the foreclosure is completed to try to vacate the foreclosure, things that'll tie you up for years. That process doesn't exist in federal court. In federal court, you can't make a motion without the approval from the judge. So there's no such thing as serial, not junk motions to stall down the process. The federal court system is also, the judges in federal court typically have micromanagement control over the timelines. And they watch every day, and we get reminders, and much more is expected of the attorneys in New York in federal court than typically in state court. We found that to be a distinct advantage because the attorneys who customarily represent defendants in foreclosures, more times than not, don't have the skill or the time to defend a case in federal court in the same way they would in state court. In state court, it's often just simply about stalling to let your client live in the house for as long as possible. That doesn't work in federal court. The judges, as a rule of thumb, don't allow it. And God help anybody who gets in the way of a federal court judge timelines and instructions. So by the time you whittle this down, with a typically a better bench, a better set of judges with better equipped courthouses, better staffing, better timelines, and control over the motion process, you're more likely to have a favorable outcome or a more favorable timeline on an outcome on a foreclosure in New York than if you were in state court. During COVID, we were keeping track of our federal court cases during COVID, and we had about half a dozen that we had completed. In other words, from the filing of the complaint to the judgment, not the sale, because we don't have control over the sale timeline, but from filing the complaint to the judgment, which is really the end of the process, under 6 months. We had some in the 167 day timeline. We had one for 179 days, under 6 months, and we had a whole stack of them well under 1 year. That would
These
be
are all in New York City.
Great.
Come again?
What part of New York was that?
Yeah.
Some of them, there are the districts in New York. There's the Southern District, which is mostly New York City. There's the Eastern District, which is Long Island and Brooklyn, and then you have the Northern and Western districts. These were two of them, I believe, were Southern, two were Eastern, and a couple upstate. But even in the upstate courts, which aren't as state courts, which aren't as slow as downstate, to get in and out in under a year is unheard of in state court. That's just not happening.
Usually, what my experience was, it's usually about 280 to 360 minimums, and then you're above that usually.
280 to 360. That you post-COVID, it's just the beginning of post-COVID in New York. The moratorium on foreclosures and evictions ended January 15th, so that's about a month ago. So we're still working our way through the new world. But my personal estimate is, for downstate New York, where most of the activity is, meaning New York City, Long Island, Westchester, Rockland, whatever the timeframes were pre-COVID, add on between 50% or double the timeframes.
Yeah, both of my foreclosures that I had were upstate New York, and both of them took over 2 years.
Yeah, which is, for upstate New York isn't too bad.
To me, that's ridiculous.
I agree with you. It's an abomination that nothing should take that long to enforce.
Right.
No, if you don't pay your car loan, we used to do auto repossession work. And if you don't pay your car loan, your car is going to be hauled off in a matter of days on the back of a truck. But there are different rules that apply. You can't repossess a home. You can't jack it up and put it on a trailer and tow it away typically. And there are different rules that apply. But right now, what we're seeing is not only the backlog in the court system from things logjam during COVID and also the new filings that have started, but you add to that process the fact that we can't do auctions in the courtrooms like we used to do. And there has to be safety protocols in place post-COVID, which means, and there were also safety protocols in the courtroom. So in Brooklyn, for example, on a typical day in Kings County in the foreclosure parts, you would see hundreds, if not thousands of people jammed into the building waiting for something to happen. That's not the case anymore. So the existing log jam is log jammed further, and then add onto that all of the files that have been backlogged for 2 years and the lack of activity. It's anybody's guess what's going to happen.
So what you're saying, Lance, is that we typically go through a year plus of upstate New York, and you're telling me you're able to do it in 6 months.
It depends on each case
Yeah,
stands on its
absolutely.
own. But we've had enough cases in the 6-month range that I could tell you that it's possible, because I know it's possible because it's happened. That can it happen again? If it's happened once, it can happen again. It's
And then
happened.
the question then is it more expensive then to do this? I mean, it's a short time frame, it's great. Is it double the price? Because
It's not double the price. The legal fees are more than the Fannie Mae rates. The reason that we're able to do this, our law firm is able to do this, is because we identify, this sounds politically incorrect, and I'm going to apologize to everybody ahead of time. We identify as a boutique law firm, meaning that we're not one size fits all for everybody. We're not a Fannie Mae factory or a Freddie Mac foreclosure mill. We don't have that kind of volume. In federal court, the rules require that the attorney who signs the complaint is the attorney on the case.
wow.
And that's it. So we can't send appearance counsel into federal court like we can in state court. So that of course raises the fees. And there are a couple of other fees which are a wee bit higher. So but if you spend another $2,000 or $3,000 in legal fees on a foreclosure, but you're in and out of court in 6 months rather than 6 years, I would say you're ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it
It's
also
amazing.
allows you to bid on the notes. You can bid on the note sales much more competitively than the buyers who are expecting to go into state court. They're bidding based upon a 3, 4, 5 year time frame, and you're bidding on based upon a 6 to 12 month time frame.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you have it. You know, everyone understand the fact you get your money faster. You're not paying the property tax bill for another 6 months or so, right?
And the forced place insurance
Yeah.
and
Forced
code
place insurance,
violations.
server fees,
Right.
all those things add up. That $2,000 is probably a net much higher, right?
So
So
I don't give advice I don't take. So I had a pool of loans that I bought recently. One, we were able to get into federal court. My name wasn't on it, so I didn't have a problem with that. So this gives me the opportunity to tell you about what you need to do to get into federal court. First, the case has to involve money over $75,000. That's easy. That's virtually everything in New York, except for possibly some small second mortgages, will be over 75,000. Number one. Number two, you have to have what's called diversity. Diversity means that the plaintiff is a different citizen than the defendants, and that's where it gets tricky. I have 3 of our very skilled associates on with us in the background, and they can tell you when they get a file and we do a diversity check, which means we have to check the LLC, who owns the LLC. If the LLC is owned by other LLCs, who owns those LLCs. So the ownership, it's almost like a 23andMe or an Ancestry.com family tree. We have to do the entire family tree for the entity that owns the loan. For small private investors, it's very easy. If you are buying a loan and you live in Pennsylvania, you don't vote in New York, you don't have an address in New York, you have no contact with New York, except to come in occasionally and see a Broadway show, and you set up a Pennsylvania LLC, that removes one of the big obstacles in the diversity check. We would just have to make sure that none of the defendants who are named in the foreclosure have a Pennsylvania address.
gotcha.
And that's our work, the bulk of our work, the real heavy lifting is done the first few minutes we get the file, because we have to check the diversity. So when there's for example, with the banks that own properties by a trust, I'm holding up my hand. We'll see trust agreements that are this thick. They have to be reviewed because we found out the hard way, there's sometimes something buried deep inside the trust agreement that will kill the diversity that we're looking for.
So what you're
So,
saying is, just a recap, is that the balance, legal balance loan has to be above 75,000, right?
correct,
And that no party from the defense side, LLC or person, husband or wife, anyone on the defense side can't have a residency. The property could be in New York, but they have a residency in PA. You cannot file in court with them in federal court because of the fact that if you live in PA or the company's in PA, then you can't. But if you're in Florida, all's good.
that's generally the case. We'd have to examine it on a case-by-case basis because Florida, for example, there are an untold number of people who have Florida residences who still keep their New York residence. So even Florida, even though Florida may be their 186 day a year residence for tax purposes, the other 184 days are in New York, and that may create a problem. So we have to examine each case on a case-by-case basis. It's in state court, all you need to go into state court is a mortgage that was filed against a property located in New York. Bingo. Now you can use the state courts. But federal court is a little bit more restricted because of the rules and the US Constitution and the way federal courts are set up.
So
But that's, generally speaking, what you said, Dave, was correct.
okay, so I got two questions. So first one is foreigners. Can a Canadian-owned company do this?
The answer is, it depends upon the citizenship, and we would have to review that on a case-by-case basis. We don't have too many foreigners, with all due respect to our friends from the Great White North. We don't have too many coming in here to buy loans and foreclose. So, but if you find yourself considering buying a loan and want to do this in federal court, I would suggest contact us first, and we can help you establish the parameters for the
Okay.
purchase. But just let me give you a caveat before I forget.
Sure.
If a case is already pending in state court, you can't stop it and hop over to federal court. But
Okay.
if you're starting a case anew, you can access the federal court if you meet all the timelines, and guidelines rather. And I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Matt.